I'm Joe Kennedy. I want to thank you. I'm a senior fellow with ITIF, and I want to thank you all for coming here. As our first thing in order, we're very delighted to have Congressman Peter Roskam, who's agreed to give some opening remarks on this important topic. Congressman Roskam represents Illinois' 6th District, covering Winfield, West Chicago, St. Charles, and Barrington. He's currently in his 6th term of office, and he serves as the Ways and Means Health Committee chairman for the 115th Congress, where he plays a leading role on issues affecting the healthcare industry. The congressman was instrumental also in achieving last year's important tax reform bill. He also sits on the Tax Policy Subcommittee and has previously led its Oversight Committee, a key watchdog post with jurisdiction into the spending and operations of the tax writing and healthcare programs within the federal government. Congressman Roskam is also chairman of the House Democracy Partnership, which assists legislatures in emerging democracies, and he also serves as co-chair of the House Republican Israel Caucus and serves on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. Congressman, pleased to have you. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, Joe, thank you very much. And for those of you who are attending today, I appreciate the opportunity to greet you. And for our panelists, thank you so much for your willingness to bring your expertise. Let me just give you a little bit of a sense of perspective on why this topic is so important. I think we've come to have an understanding that in our lifetimes, amazing medical things are happening, and it's almost become passé. And we have an expectation that there are medical technological breakthroughs. We have an expectation that our lives will be easier to live, that we will live healthier lives, longer lives, and we'll have all these benefits. But those things don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen just because. They happen because the United States historically has had a milieu. It has had an entrepreneurial environment that has rewarded risk. It has created an underlying, an underlying structure of pure research that has gone in. And upon that foundation and a national consensus, we've been the beneficiary of this. And I think that it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we not only preserve that, but that we expand that. And if you put these things into a larger framework, this is a very interesting season that we're in right now. And it becomes interesting. I've recently taken over and I've assumed the leadership of the Health Subcommittee at the Ways and Means Committee. And if you look at this, we've got an opportunity to do incredibly significant things on healthcare, and yet our debate has really been stymied. And what you're going to see coming out of the Ways and Means Committee in the next several months is an effort to revisit regulatory burdens that are in place in the healthcare space that don't make patients healthier and don't bring costs down. Said another way, we've got to reframe the debate about healthcare. So here's the challenge. If you ask members of Congress what their opinion is of the Affordable Care Act, for example, they will tell you. And by asking that question, people go immediately into their corners, and it gets shirts and skins. And we see what that looks like. What we're proposing right now at the Ways and Means Committee is a different question. The questions about the ACA are interesting and they need to be reconciled and dealt with, but we're proposing is a different question to healthcare providers in particular. We're proposing this. What are the regulations that are in place that don't drive innovation, that don't drive health, and are just duplicative and overwhelming, and in some cases, if you're talking on a personal level with providers, just disheartening? What are those? And what we've gotten is incredibly thoughtful, forward-leaning feedback. With specificity, they've been able to say through a series of roundtables that we've had at a subcommittee, this was initiated by Pat Teaberry, who was my predecessor, and now we've taken it up and we're trying to follow through on this. With specificity, they're saying, here's what we need to do. Let me just give you one quick example, and then I'll yield my time. I was recently interacting with a health facility in my constituency. I represent suburban Chicago, and I was visiting with a health system, and I'm in one of their facilities, and they said, and I posed that question, what are the regulations that are so difficult they're ridiculous? And they said, oh, Congressman, we've got one. They were recently part of a review where Medicare came through, CMS came through, or their designees, and they were inspecting their facility. And the reviewer came through and said, oh, you've got a problem here with your HVAC system. Right, that look is what they did. HVAC system. What's our problem with the HVAC system? This is all top drawer. This is all fire inspected. This is all, world class. This is all the latest stuff. And the guy said, you've got a problem because this shaft is 18 inches too close to something. I don't even know what it was, but it's 18 inches too close to it. And you can imagine this feeling of just how ridiculous this is. And the bottom line was $1.5 million later, they had to move the shaft. Okay, it's ridiculous. And what we came to learn was it wasn't the facility that was out of date, it was the CMS standard that was out of date. So herein you take my point. This discussion today about innovation is held down by those types of regulations. Now, we need regulations, obviously, that are in place. We don't want snake oil on the marketplace being represented as a cure for anything. But what we do want is an environment where there is an expectation that we can have transformational things that come out. And the life sciences are right at the heart of this. So I think today's panelists are going to give very, very good insight. We're going to get really good perspective on this. And I think those of you who are in the policymaking sphere, and I think that's everybody here, we need to be mindful of that goal. That goal is let's make sure that we have here in the United States, based on the benefit of tax changes that we've made and based on IP laws and so forth, let's make sure that we've got this as the milieu in which innovators want to come and we can see these great things happening. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to our paths crossing soon. So Joe, back to you.
Thank you again, Congressman. So I'm going to introduce our panel, and then I'm going to give about 20 minutes worth of remarks to about a recent report I did for ITIF, and then our panelists will have about 7 to 10 minutes of comments each, and we'll turn it over to questions. So starting at my end of the table, Mitch Horowitz is a Principal Managing Director for Techonomy LLC. Mitch has worked as an economic development consultant, state development official, and then as an executive in a clinical trials informatics company and mezzanine finance group. He served until December 2015 as Vice President and Managing Director of Battelle's Technology Partnership Practice. He is now a Principal and Managing Director of Techonomy Partners, which transitioned the full capabilities of Battelle's TPP into a new independent organization. Techonomy has written a slew of papers on the pharma industry, and I'm not sure I could have done my report had I not relied heavily on those. And many of the statistics I cite in my presentation originate from Techonomy reports. He's developed a strong track record with Techonomy in advancing the biosciences development strategies in specialized assessments of state and regional governments, including state studies of Arizona, Georgia, Washington State, and Maryland. He's authored national studies with the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America on best practices and international competitiveness issues, which he'll talk about today, as well as with the Biotechnology Industry Organization on state biosciences development trends, STEM education, in industry-university partnerships in translational research. Mitch holds a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and a BS from Cornell. Amy Miller is president and CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research. She previously worked at the Personalized Medicine Coalition, where she served as executive vice president, working with various parties on scientific policy and business challenges affecting personalized medicine. Before joining PMC, Dr. Miller worked in the office of the Director of National Institute of Mental Health, where she served as a liaison among the scientific community, the legislative branch, and consumers of mental health care in their facilities. She's a former American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellow and also served as a domestic policy advisor for Senator Jay Rockefeller. She received a bachelor's degree from the University of New Orleans and holds a doctoral degree in human development from the University of Connecticut. Joe Devaney serves as Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs for Astellas, which is a U.S. subsidiary of Tokyo-based Astellas Pharma Incorporated. Mr. Devaney leads the Policy and Government Affairs team and is responsible for developing, communicating, and executing the company's federal and state government strategies, engagement activities, and its policy development efforts across all functional areas. He joined Astellas after 20 years at Sanofi and his predecessor companies, where he held roles of increasing responsibility in federal public policy and market access. Prior to that, he was a Director of State Government Affairs at Sandoz, and he's also supported the New Jersey State Legislature for 8 years, including as a research director and chief of staff in the New Jersey General Assembly. He received his Bachelor of Science degree from Drexel University in Philadelphia and his master's degree in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Doug Dorfler is president and CEO of MaxCite. He has more than 35 years of experience in the discovery, development, commercialization, and international financing of biotechnology products and companies. He was a founder of MaxCite in July 1998. Previous to that, he was president, CEO, and a director of Immunicon Corporation, a cell-based therapy and diagnostics company. He has also held various executive positions with Life Technologies Incorporated that included leading its global businesses, mergers and acquisitions, and its initial public offering. He plays an active role as a life sciences industry advocate, serving as chair emeritus of the Maryland Tech Council and on the executive committees of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine in the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. He received his BS in finance from the University of Baltimore School of Business and also holds a certificate in industrial relations. So as I said before, I'm Joe Kennedy. I am a senior fellow at ITIF. And I'd like to start with a few words about the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. According to a recent survey by the University of Pennsylvania, ITIF is the world's leading science and technology policy think tank. It supports policies that promote innovation, productivity, economic growth, and higher living standards. It does this by focusing on issues at the intersection of technology and public policy in a wide variety of economic sectors, including information technology, telecommunications, trade and globalization, the life sciences, and energy. This particular study is motivated by a desire to evaluate the life science sector's importance to the U.S. economy and to gauge its relative health compared to both the past and to other countries. The definition we use of life sciences includes the pharmaceutical industries, contract research firms, and medical device industries. Collectively, these employ over 1.2 million workers. A recent Techonomy report, however, gives some indication of their broader significance. The pharma industry alone supports another 3.5 million workers indirectly, both within the input industries that feed into the pharma companies and also the industries that benefit from the higher disposable incomes of pharma workers. These industries pay much higher wages than average, largely because they demand highly skilled workers. Recent output of the industries was $675 billion, roughly 4% of GDP. Collectively, they performed $80 billion in domestic research in 2013 and accounted for $90 billion in exports last year. These industries have shown strong growth over the last decade and a half. Pharmaceutical output is up 70% in real terms since 1999. Medical equipment is up 45% in that same time period. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturing has been relatively stagnant. As I said, these industries pay high wages. The pharmaceutical wages have also risen 70% in real terms since 2001. The average pharmaceutical wage is over $124,000. Biotech researchers average $152,000. The medical equipment average wage is $86.2 thousand per year. All of these are well above both the average and the median pay for the economy as a whole. Companies within these industries share several characteristics of a classic innovation sector. First, they need to generate continuous innovation in order to survive. Second, they have very high fixed costs. According to a recent estimate, it takes roughly $2.2 billion to get a drug approved in the United States. Yet it only takes a few dollars or less to produce one extra pill. So marginal costs are much lower than average costs, and a policy that tries to base prices on marginal costs will guarantee that firms lack the ability to reinvest in new research. Third, intellectual property, whether in the form of patents or protection for trade secrets, is critical to allowing companies to recover their upfront costs. Fourth, product development depends upon the unfettered movement of knowledge, information, and data across borders, not just with borders between countries, but borders between research facilities, whether government or private-owned, and companies that are capable of developing that research into products. And here the Bayh-Dole Act has been a big help. By creating a uniform patent policy among federal agencies that fund research, it gave these institutions an incentive to help get their research commercialized into usable products. And finally, these companies need access to global markets in order to lower costs. The larger the market, the higher the production runs can be, and the higher the production runs are, the lower the average costs are. There are several key components of the life sciences ecosystem. One is close cooperation between research, clinical care, and product development. Second is an access to specialized laboratory facilities. Third, it needs capital willing to invest for the long term with great uncertainty, including backing for small startup companies that are conducting promising research. It also needs a regular supply of highly skilled scientists, technicians, and engineers. Nearly 22% of all domestic pharmaceutical employees work in research and development. The ratio for medical products is 12%. Both are substantially higher than for the economy as a whole. And then finally, it needs access to specialized manufacturing facilities capable of producing to the tight tolerances of federal safety regulation. We conclude in the paper that the U.S. life sciences sector is highly competitive internationally, and this is based on several strengths. One is ownership of roughly half of the top 25 companies in both pharmaceuticals and medical products is U.S. owned. Second, we're the largest source of research and development. We also have world-class research facilities with many of the best scientists. Seven of the top 10 universities and 15 of the top 20 are located in the U.S. We have the largest and most experienced venture capital market. We give our companies strong patent protection, and we have a relatively efficient testing and approval process. The U.S. currently leads in new drug discoveries. There's been strong growth since 2002, and this is a dramatic change from the late 70s when over a 5-year period, Europe led the U.S. 149 new entities to just 66. FDA is approving more drugs. It's improved its performance in clearing drugs, and in 2017, FDA set a new record for novel drug approvals. The U.S. also spends more on research and development, both in total and as a percentage of GDP. Most of this spending comes from the private sector. And a high proportion of this R&D is spent here in the U.S. In fact, medical devices and pharmaceuticals are among the top industries as far as the percentage of total R&D that's conducted in the U.S. Domestic pharmaceutical companies performed $62.5 billion of domestic research in 2013. The vast majority of this was self-funded. Other life sciences companies spent an additional $27 billion. In 45 states, biomedical research is the largest facet of university research. In 28 states, it accounts for more than 50% of all university research. And in 2014, biomedical funding for medical research made up 41% of all private sector funding to universities. U.S. life sciences is driven by the private sector. Domestic pharmaceutical companies invested 43.8% of their total gross value added back into R&D. This is much higher than any other country. In fact, the OECD average is only 14.2. It's also much higher than any other industry in the U.S. Scientists continue to lead in patents. Triadic patents shown here are those that were deemed important enough to get patents in Europe, the U.S., and Japan. The U.S. maintains a share of these important patents at roughly 40 to 45%. In 2014, 13 states had more than 1,000 biopharmaceutical patents issued to their residents. A recent study of almost 3,300 FDA-approved drugs over the last 25 years shows that U.S. researchers led with 67% of total patents granted. Yet, the U.S. underperforms in trade. And this is a real puzzle. Why, if we're so relatively so competitive on so many other factors or indicia, why don't we have a strong trade surplus? The pharmaceutical trade deficit is large and growing. Last year, it was $56.2 billion. That's 101% of exports. This is despite the fact that exports have grown 191% over the last 15 years. The trade in medical equipment is slightly better. We've been running roughly a trade balance for the last decade and a half, but the stagnation in exports over the last few years has led to a deficit of $4.1 billion last year, or 12% of exports. I can think of three reasons. One is normal market factors in international competition, and Mitch is going to talk briefly about some of the things that other countries are doing to gain a larger share at a total value added in life sciences. But I believe there are two other things going on. One is profit shifting of profits from the U.S. into other countries, and the second is foreign price repression. The U.S. has been losing global market share, but it's important to see who it's been losing it to. It's lost market share since 2001. But if you look at the middle slide, that's the U.S. The bottom slide is China. And you can see that China's gained market share. But if you look closely, most of the U.S. loss came before China's rise. This figure shows total trade balance in pharmaceuticals for selected countries. And you can see that the U.S. and Japan at the bottom are running growing trade deficits. China is running roughly a balanced trade roughly a trade balance. The last few years have been a slight deficit. The big winners have been Switzerland and Germany. This slide shows trade balance just with the U.S. And we can see that in 2001, the trade deficit in pharmaceuticals was $3.5 billion. By 2016, it had grown to $45.6 billion. Roughly 90% of that growing deficit is accounted for by just 4 countries. 3 of these countries are developed countries that are home to large global pharmaceutical companies. Until recently, the U.S. had the OECD's highest corporate tax rate at 35%. We applied that tax rate globally to all profits of U.S. companies, but we didn't collect that tax until the profits were repatriated. This gave U.S. companies an incentive to use the legal transfer pricing rules, which inevitably give companies some discretion over how they value the intangible rights that flow between different entities within their broader global system. Some of these rights are patent rights, the marketing rights, the value of research, et cetera. They're all intangible and therefore hard to value. But the incentive clearly was for U.S. companies to try and shift profits out of U.S. subsidiaries and into foreign subsidiaries where the tax would be delayed. It also gave an incentive to foreign companies to shift profits out of their U.S. subsidiaries and into their home facilities where they would be taxed at a lower rate. I think now with the recent tax bill, a lot of this incentive may disappear. We've lowered the tax rate to 21%. We've moved to a territorial system, and we collect that tax when the profits are earned. The second thing I think is going on is price suppression. The U.S. has a relatively free market in drugs and devices. Other countries, however, suppress both demand and prices in their markets. As evidence of the former, the U.S. spends $1,162 recently on average on pharmaceuticals. The OECD average is roughly half of that, $553. In many of these countries, the government is a major buyer of medical products, including drugs. And it uses its monopsony power to drive prices in its market down so that its citizens have to pay less. And so that also the government programs that benefit these citizens have lower costs. When the BEA estimates trade flows, it largely relies on the value that's declared by the shipper at the time of the shipment. And so if U.S. companies are marking down the value of their products when they export to Germany, say, or Canada in order to reflect the lower prices that they will get once those products are sold in those markets. And if foreign companies are marking their prices up to reflect the higher prices that they'll get for imports into the U.S. market, then that will affect the trade balance. BEA does keep price indices for imports and exports of certain industries. And we can see from this chart that shortly after 2010, the price of imports diverged radically from the price of exports, with imports rising much faster relative to exports. A similar thing has happened in medical equipment and supplies. Imports, again, have risen relative to exports in price. I calculated roughly that if this divergence had not occurred, that it would have eliminated roughly 40% of the current deficit in trade deficit in pharmaceuticals. The U.S. also keeps figures on trade based on quantity rather than value. And if you compare those statistics and use the same price for imports and exports, it actually turns the deficit into a large surplus. So I believe that both profit shifting and price suppression have been important effects. So what can the government do to boost the life sciences competitiveness? First, ITIF has long called for expanding the alternative simplified R&D tax credit, which most companies use, from its current value of 14% to 20% or higher, and implementing a more robust innovation box. Second, we need to continue to reverse the long-term decline in NIH funding. We also need to continue to expand the workforce training in STEM fields. The U.S. government needs to pass healthcare reforms that restore long-term financial stability to the insurance markets and therefore provide adequate reimbursement for new drug therapies and products. And finally, we do need to address unfair trade practices by other countries. These practices include IP theft and compulsory licenses, but they also include the widespread use of monopsony prices by governments to drive the value of U.S. exports down. I want to thank you all for attending again, and I'm going to turn it over, first of all, to Mitch.
So I think that one thing that's real important here is Joe's painted a picture of just an American success story. If we went back to the 1930s, we were not a leader in life science industries. And over the course of time, we've really stepped up to take that leadership. And I know that he got talking a lot about trade deficits and stuff, but I think what you'll hear from me is that we have something that is extraordinary, that is an amazing economic driver across our states, for our nation, and it's something that if we don't pay attention to, we may lose that ground. We wrote a report years ago, we called Gone Tomorrow. And I think we're doing a lot of the right things, but I want to first step back and give a sense from someone at the state and regional level what they see as the driving forces of the life sciences and why it stands out as such an important economic development driver that well over 40 states in some way or form are trying to move forward. The first kind of relates to what Joe was saying, which was that when you look at states and their university R&D base, most states, the majority of their R&D base is found in the life sciences. And when you think about the life sciences, this is an innovation-driven business. You cannot be in this business and succeeding without innovation. And so when you have your university base primarily in it, you have the opportunity to have lots of shots on goal. You have the ability to really grow something. And it's also been an industry that has continuously grown. We do this study for Bio every 2 years. We'll be coming out with one at the June convention. I can tell you that every year through the 2000s and into the second decade of the 21st century, the life sciences has continued to grow. Even in the recession years, it weathered the recession quite well. And it continues to grow year after year after year. So this is an industry where we're able to take all these innovations and actually translate them into jobs. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of activities, it's not all about R&D activities that happen. It's about manufacturing, it's about testing labs, it's about distribution, it's about making devices. So there's a lot of different kinds of ways that states can win in this. And in fact, when you look at the geographic footprint, 28 states and over 200 regions of this country, metro regions, have an industry specialization in one of the subfields of the life sciences. So not only do we have an R&D base that's focused, but we actually have an economy where this can be an important driver. I just got back from time in Arizona where we've done a lot of work, and that state, while it's not the preeminent industry, it is a steady gainer of jobs for that state. And so the other thing I'd like to say about it and why states get excited about it is because of the broad spectrum of jobs. While we know scientists and engineers and MDs are really important, a lot of the jobs that are in the life sciences go well beyond that. Production jobs, there are 19 states that had over 15% of their overall life sciences in production jobs, well above what we have for the US as an average for manufacturing. We have a lot of jobs in management, clinical trials, regulatory affairs. So that really stands out. And of course, we have that healthcare dividend, which is so very important to states. Again, kind of using an example in Arizona, very few folks in this country spend a lot of time on valley fever research, but they do it in Arizona, and they're coming up with new diagnostics now that are being commercialized into companies. And that's the kind of emphasis that can be placed around the life sciences. You can identify what your state needs, what your region needs, and do it, and that's really important. But how do states do it, right? I mean, this is a really tough industry. Joe gave you a real good sense of it. That was close ties between industry and academia. 80% of the most transformative drugs over the last 25 years resulted from collaborations of industry with universities. The challenge of these long development life cycles, this is certainly not a quick hit industry. This is an industry that requires complex science often to be applied, then to go through very difficult regulatory environment and testing. And so it takes a very, very long time, over 10 years and $3 billion to develop a new drug. And so what happens in this industry is you have what they call the valley of death. And to kind of give you a feel for that and help you see how states are having to react to it, states have had to step up and think very hard about how they're going to work with this industry, unlike almost any other advanced industry in America. So it has such specialized requirements. And so in the R&D side, you have states like Arkansas with their Biosciences Institute making direct investments, places like Maryland, Connecticut, California doing stuff in regenerative medicine to bring one of the most exciting fields forward. You have eminent scholars. Georgia Research Alliance is very well known, but the Texas Cancer Institute has been doing it recently, and USTAR in Utah. You have matching grants to work and get industry and universities working together. So very exciting things that have happened. One of the most exciting events is actually something that Vice President Pence invested in just before he left as governor in Indiana, called the Indiana Biosciences Research Institute. That industry drives research agendas and works collaboratively with the universities. You have technology commercialization. How do we make sure that those great research discoveries don't get lost? Buy-dole is critical, as Joe mentioned, but states are doing proof of concept funding. They're doing co-investment on the SBIR program, a very important program. They're doing things in new venture development, and there the big thing is placemaking. We're learning that places matter in terms of how you move forward. So when you look at these efforts, what Joe was indicating before was that we would not be winning in this industry without the focus of the federal government on this and the kind of policy framework that they set out, both in the regulatory, the IP, buy-dole, all those things, funding of NIH. Without that, we would not be successful in the state levels and the regions, so where jobs get created across the U.S. But what we're facing right now is very significant headwinds from global competition. So in things like government funding, patent innovation, publications, we are no longer, in terms of the trends, keeping pace with our top competitors. And so what are the international competitors doing? Well, they're actually learning from us. They are doubling down on the things that we did to begin with, and that many states are working towards, but they're doing it at a national level. They're growing their R&D base while we've been kind of up and down. Depending upon what time frame you take, it's either a decline or it's maybe a slight increase in NIH. They've been focused on accelerating commercialization. They've been actually trying to move past us on something that we do so well, which is science-based regulatory oversight. And they've been moving forward tremendously. The Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe is quite strong. They've been strengthening their capacity to manufacture, and they've been working on STEM talent. And you're going to hear from the rest of the panelists about what makes a difference. And we did some work where we surveyed strategic planning executives across pharma and asked them what really matters in terms of where you cite. And they basically said, listen, U.S. is a high-quality place, and we compete on our quality, but we better have strong IP protections, we better have that well-functioning regulatory system, and we really need to ensure that we figure out a system. While we all want good quality health care for all Americans, we need to make sure that we have a coverage and payment policy that really values and supports that. And I think the rest of the panelists will give really good focus to why that's important from their own experiences, and really thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us, and look forward to your questions.
Hello, everyone. I'm Amy Miller from the Society for Women's Health Research, and I do not have slides. I want to thank Joe for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you. The Society for Women's Health Research is a nearly 30-year-old organization that was founded on two core missions. One, encourage women in STEM, and the other is to include women in clinical trials. At the time of founding, women were actively excluded from participating in all NIH-funded trials, and were also not included in most pharmaceutical and medical device research. So we successfully, as an organization, advocated for women to be included in all NIH clinical trials. And for those of you who follow it, you now know that NIH has a policy that even cell lines and animal models have to report the biology of those animals and cells. But that means that most of what we know about human health is male biology. Female biology remains largely undiscovered. Our mission, therefore, is to improve human health through research on the differences between men and women, and also research on areas of healthcare where there's undue or sole burden on women. Our vision is to be a neutral convener, to bring together thought leaders, to puzzle out these questions and figure out very productive solutions. The question before us today is, how can the U.S. remain globally competitive? And I am going to give you my perspective. I agree with all of Joe's points and the points made before us. His fourth point was U.S. health policy, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And let's start with research. I absolutely agree that an R&D tax credit is important and can spur innovation. We talk about the importance of research. We talk about the importance of differences between men and women, similarities in disease, diagnosis, treatment, and obviously and hopefully eventually prevention and cures. But how do we get there? There's a role for government. We need to keep doing that. But there's also a role for industry. Again, 30 years ago when we advocated that NIH include women in clinical trials, we did that same exact advocacy within industry, and it worked. So for the last 12 or 15 years, depending on the company, women have, again, been included in clinical trials. but they aren't yet 50%. I don't blame industry. I don't blame FDA. We do, however, need to talk about clinical trial participation. We need to talk about the burden of participation. For those of you who are in clinical trials or have tried to recruit into them, it's a big burden on the participant. And is the burden necessary? So let's have a very clever conversation about how much does FDA require? How much does industry need for assurances? And let's have a thoughtful and honest, creative conversation about how to reduce burden on humans who participate in research. I also think we need to talk about research and unmet need. We had great innovations in unmet need that have had a trickle-down effect, but we've also had some gaps in our research. So let's think about painful conditions. We treat the symptoms, but not the disease. So let's make a list. Let's make a list of painful conditions for which there is no direct treatment. And let's focus our incentives, federal and public and private, on those unmet needs. And then finally, again, I'm going to just do a little cheerleading for the differences between men and women. Research on women improves human health. And I like to tell the story of non-small cell lung cancer. Non-small cell lung cancer was generally treated with radiation and chemotherapy. And then a company, specifically AstraZeneca, noticed they had a drug that worked magic on a group of people. And yes, they data dived. They tried to figure out what it was. It took them years. They won't admit how many years because it might be embarrassing. But they finally found out that this drug worked on women, a group of women in their study populations. And from that, we now have about 55–60% of non-small cell lung cancer treated with targeted therapeutics. That mutation was EGFR. And getting the EGFR mutation, the drug and the diagnostics, to market was onerous. But then fast forward to the ALK mutation, and that happened much quicker because research on women benefited a whole area of disease. And so we need to understand the differences in biology. There's also some fascinating aspects to the female body. For example, in pregnancy, did you know that viral load plummets in hepatitis? So clearing hepatitis virus from a woman post-delivery is easier than it is for others. Why? And what can we learn about that to improve human health? We need to talk about that. How can we modernize the regulatory system? So we've done it. We've done the research. We've got a cool new thing. Maybe it's a drug, maybe it's a device, maybe it's a procedure. But now we've got FDA. I would like to argue that FDA has done a lot of creative things, and we can learn from the creativity they've experienced in the past and maybe suggest using those lessons. So again, clinical trial participation. We need to talk about it. We need to talk about the role of the NIH. We need to talk about the role of the regulators, and we need to talk about what industry needs in terms of assurances. It does need to be a careful dialogue for certain. We do need to protect the safety of patients. We need to make sure those new things are efficacious, but we can do it. Also, boxes are blurring. Again, back to the non-small cell lung cancer example, the non-smokers' lung cancer. There was drugs. Then they were targeted through diagnostic tests. Then there were biologics. Then there are devices that have a drug or maybe a biologic in it. And then there are digital health tools. Now, those are different regulators for all of those pieces. But again, let's think about what we learned. When personalized medicine started rolling into the FDA, the device center and the drug center did not speak the same language. They do now. What can we learn from that? And we were talking about 2 centers. Now we're talking about a 3rd center or a 4th center or a center that doesn't exist to regulate something we can't even define if it's a medical device or not. And I am talking about digital health services. Those lines are blurring. So again, let's have a creative conversation about regulatory modernization that can improve the path to market. So we've done the research. We've got the cool new thing. We've got a really creative FDA who's made sure it's safe and effective and it hits the market. Well, we do have one more really, well, we have two, but let's talk about coverage and payment policy since you can control that and not physician practice. So we have an access problem. And again, we could talk all day long about the problems with coverage, payment, and access policy. But instead of talking about the problems, let's talk about what works and why it worked. So again, let's take non-invasive prenatal testing. That medical test, it's a blood test, hit the market about 2012, 2013. And for a diagnostic test that was proprietary, it got coverage and payment and patient access extraordinarily quickly. Why? A person who was pregnant could find out really early what trisomies were in their fetus. They could find out about the health of their child very early and prepare for what was going to come down. Physicians liked it because it replaced an invasive test, and we are talking about high-risk pregnancies, replaced invasive testing with something that was non-invasive. So practice changed very quickly. And then payers liked it too, for same reasons. It replaced an invasive test with a blood test. What can we learn from that example? Let's go to non-small cell lung cancer again. I like to keep it simple. So again, at first, it was really hard to get physicians to change practice, but then we recognized marker after marker after marker, and we had test after test after test. Then we had panels, then whole genome sequencing. Then we had many different drugs a physician could choose from. And yet, that challenged boxes. So are we talking about the drug spend? If you're a health plan, are we talking about the drug spend? Are we talking about the doctor's visits? Are we talking about the surgery? Are we talking about other ancillary services? Well, these are all boxes. And so again, we need to have a very creative conversation about coverage and payment policy. And I would argue that we look at what works, what has worked in our past, and then think about some policy levers we can pull on those things. So in conclusion, I would argue we need to incentivize research in a few different ways. We need to modernize our regulatory system, and we need to provide access through good coverage and payment policy. Thank you.
Joe, if it's okay with you, Doug and I will
Okay.
present from here. Thank you all for being here and for spending some time with us. Joe, thank you for having us. You all have copies of the ITIF report, which we completely endorse. We think it's badly needed in terms of understanding and timeliness. And as I go through this, you'll get a sense that there's some really wonderful things happening, and there are some other things that require attention from people who work on the Hill, but people who are part of this community and set national policy for us. We have long understood the value of writings and discoveries. It's part of our DNA in the United States. And as a result of that, we've come to a place, at least when it comes to biomedical research, of being in a dominant position globally. Joe did a fantastic job of describing it. Mitch brought that down to the local level. Amy then brought it into specific therapeutic areas. There's a lot going on, and thank goodness I have a mother yesterday, had her birthday at 89, finished her birthday, and then went back to take care of her sister, who's 100 years old and lives in the same house with her. So statins, heart devices, all of those things are making life better. The fact, though, is that we can lose dominance overnight. Technologies like highly intense, ultra-fast lasers, we're losing dominance in that field. That has military applications. It may have medical applications down the road. That's an area where we thought we had a lead and suddenly found out we didn't. And then, as Congressman Roscom had mentioned, these amazing medical technologies, which I'm going to steal and use that acronym AMTs to refer to this whole basket of medicines that are about to enter our space. And you've seen some of them. Keytruda, on the market, life-saving medication for people who had no hope at all. And there are others like that that will be coming along fairly soon, and they're very expensive. Astellas is a mid-sized, foreign domiciled company. So why would they be here to support U.S. Intellectual property, reimbursement, and network policies? We're here because in 2008, we chose to be here. And I think there's some lessons in that decision that would make you all wonder, okay, what do we need to do now to ensure that we don't lose that edge so that companies from overseas want to be here? And by the way, if you had an Excel spreadsheet that showed various companies and their measures of performance and tax liability and export capability, and you blinded the names, my company would look very much like American companies, which is full testimony to what Joe has been presenting. When we take a look at Astellas, its initial footprint was in Illinois. It's now in California, dealing with neuroscience and cell research. It's in Boston. It's growing in Boston. It has partnerships in Maryland. It has new research facilities in Washington State. It's growing and expanding, and it's bringing in young researchers, bringing in new opportunities for startups in all of those locations. Our hope is to create platforms around gene and cell therapy, around regenerative medicine, around viruses that can deliver new medications. We're keenly interested in exploring partnerships and have pretty much followed a model that all biopharma companies are following, and that is to be less dependent on internal research and much more dependent on external research, whether it's a startup, academic researchers, or government activities. To buttress that, we do things like invest in STEM education programs, particularly for needy populations. That's a commitment that we've made. It's something that we do as a matter of routine. And we're also cognizant of the intellectual property protections that are available here. And this is kind of the takeaway for you, I hope. Why does a business care about intellectual property? In our world, business decisions require some degree of predictability and even certainty. Why? Because you can't value an asset if you don't know how long it's going to be protected. So a decision to go into a clinical trial or to move from bench to the next phase, or to engage in a partnership with a startup or a university, all of that has to be brought out, not just because we care about the money, but others care about the money. The shareholders, the investor analyst, even the government now is wondering, what's the value of that asset? And without that level of certainty around intellectual property protection, you can't really predict the net present value of an asset. That's a core business activity that we all have. The U.S. happens to provide a much higher level of forecasting and predictability. That is a huge competitive advantage for this country. It's something that we have to maintain. And so when you have disruptions in the intellectual property regime that may include some unintended consequences, suddenly you're backwashing into this decision-making system all sorts of things that folks hadn't counted on when they started or hadn't hoped when they started their career, hoped for when they started their career. How things will be enforced, how a patent will be brought to its end, those are things that matter greatly to the value of an asset and the scientific effort behind it. Our partnership environment, and this gets to things that are beyond the law, beyond a budget, our partnership environment is highly transparent and highly collaborative. People want to go to Boston because it's a place where there's not only science, but people want to get things done, not just sit in a university library and wait. They're out there, they're looking for opportunity, they're trying to build that next generation of AMTs that we're all waiting for. So that piece is important. And then the reimbursement environment, well understood, very predictable. There are few irrational barriers to market entry, as there are in other countries. That gives us a sense that this is a good place to be and a good place to hire scientists and other workers who can bring value to the market for patients. That is the value chain that you're looking to establish. Our network opportunities, I think, are exactly what I had described. External options are increasingly important, but I would say be concerned. There were 2 reports, one from the National Research Council and one from the National Academies, about universities and their inability to partner well with industry. That is something that I think requires attention. It was mentioned that NIH may require attention as well. For us, we co-locate. We are co-present in places that have these university assets, places like Texas, places like Maryland. We are looking for that unfettered exchange of ideas that I referenced in terms of Boston. The last piece that I'll talk about is a little bit disturbing, but it gets back to the AMT issue, and that is the fact that science is outrunning reimbursement. Our science is going to arrive very quickly, and we are not ready for it. Stem cell therapy, cell and gene therapy is on the horizon, the immediate horizon, and we have Medicare Part B, Medicare Part D. They're struggling to keep up with medicines that are available now and that are old technologies in some cases. We've got to find a way through. So if you're in this community or you're on the Hill, it's important to start thinking about what is just ahead if we want to keep this drive forward. The other problem here, of course, is affordability and access. This is not a country that believes in medicine for the few. That's not an option here. So we have to find a way of getting Congressman Roskam's AMTs into the clinic, into the labs where people can benefit from that value. Unfortunately, I think it's true that our insurance benefit design has hollowed out over the recent past. You're seeing a rise in high deductible health plans. You're seeing a doubling of deductibles in health plans as a percent of health plans in the last 5 years. These are the sorts of things that won't lead to coverage of AMTs. And so thought being given to that reimbursement system, to the prudent nature of protecting our intellectual property system, and making sure that network facilitation in the states and elsewhere, I think is a critical aspect of what lies ahead. Doug, I'll leave it with you.
Great, thanks everybody for staying to the bitter end. I represent a small company. MaxCyte is about 50 employees, and we're called a startup, an emerging company, a small biotech company. And there's about 1,600 of us in the U.S., and we do represent a really dramatic force in the development of new medicines. More than 2/3 of the treatments that are currently being developed in clinical trials today are being conducted by these small companies like mine. About half of the approvals this year, those treatments were discovered and developed by small companies like ours in 2017. There are a number of extraordinary new drugs coming out, and if there's one thing you could do for me is to write down 2 words, well, 1 word, CAR-T. CAR-T is a new drug. Two products got approved this year, one called Chimera and the other one was Yescarta. And this is a revolutionary new product where you take cells from a patient, you engineer those cells to recognize cancer, you put those cells back into the patient, and those cells kill the cancer cells. Now, what's been remarkable about this is that there's been several hundred patients that have been treated. And all of these patients have gone through 7, 8, 9 different courses of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, surgical therapy. 2/3 of them walked out of the hospital in remission. It's absolutely astounding. And you're seeing a rush of companies going into the cell therapy space. You're also seeing a rush of companies going into the gene editing and gene therapy space. There was an approval this year of a gene therapy for the treatment of inherited blindness. These were patients who were blind at birth, and they're able to get their sight back. It's just truly remarkable. And because of that advance in the clinic, you're seeing much more investment. You're seeing much more partnerships by big pharma companies, and you're seeing a huge number of new targets going after. People are going after inherited genetic disease. They're going after things like hemophilia and sickle cell disease, diseases that we thought were intractable before, where you're using this investment, using the technology to move this forward. Now, this all doesn't come without all the things we talked about today, because there is a mosaic. There's an ecosystem that transcends all of us in this room. It goes down to the state level. Rich Bendis and Brian Darmody from Maryland are 2 colleagues of mine, and we work very closely together as an organization to make sure that our companies get the most we can from our local and state support. We know about how costly and lengthy these drugs take to develop. We are going in the clinic this year with a treatment for ovarian cancer. It's a cell that's been engineered to go back into the patient to treat just an incredibly serious disease. Now, I don't know how long it's going to take me, but I hire people in now, and I suspect I'm going to get to meet their grandchildren because it's probably going to be 15 or 20 years before. So when these people join these companies, they're here for the long term. It's not two people and a dog in a garage. They're investing their careers. And what that also requires is very patient investors, both the employees and then the investors. Because if you think about the risk, you have a 10% chance of being successful. We've all heard that number when you go into clinical trials. And it takes 15 years. Well, investors have a lot of different investments they can make. They can invest in an app, right? And maybe get a return in 2 years. 10 times their money, who knows? So we need patient capital, and patient capital is there. They're getting returns on the kind of work that we've been talking about all day. But there's a couple things that are really important to ensure that patient capital stays. We need a very strong regulatory environment, the FDA. We need strong leadership, and we need science-based regulations. That's critical. And you've seen that over the last decade or so. We've had very strong leadership and science-based and very transparent, we believe, regulations. Secondly, we need a very strong intellectual property. Some of us, I believe that it's under siege right now. I've seen some work that happened with the IPR that just happened recently. That's a good move because there were companies that were being shorted, their stocks were being shorted, and then the company, the hedge fund that shorted the stock, was the next day putting out an IPR to challenge the patent so that stock price would go down. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the industry, and we need strong intellectual property because in some cases, our company, in fact, my company, was founded on a single patent, and I could not have raised the money I raised without that single patent. So the patent system needs to be strong, it needs to be protected, and we need to have people in it who are thinking about this on the long term. Tax code. The tax reform, the tax cut that happened, really had little impact on small pre-revenue companies, at least not directly, because we don't pay taxes, right? We are losing money year over year over year. But there are three things that we do ask that you think about. One is that in Section 382, which is the NOLs, we lose our NOLs when we do financing. Now, the NOL laws were created to prevent people from trafficking NOLs. But in a biotech company, when you do a financing, sometimes you trip up the change of control. And when you trip up the change of control, you lose all the NOLs that you accumulated over those years. And so if you do have an event where you actually bring in income that year, you're going to be taxed at the current rate without the benefit of any of those NOLs. It doesn't seem to be particularly fair, but two, it really does strip these companies away from an asset that they've built, and the understanding that eventually they're going to want to pay taxes because that's what we all want to do in biotech. We all really do want to pay taxes eventually. And that fixes to Section 1202, which again is tax preferred treatment for qualified small business investors. We need to incentivize investors. That's what we need to do because they're the ones that provide the oxygen to our companies and allow us to do the things that we love to do, which is discover and develop new medicines and treat people. And there's also expanding the eligibility for the R&D payroll tax credit. And then finally, I'd like to just put another word in for the fostering innovation legislation that will help to extend the Jobs Act. I think it's passed the House. It needs to go through Senate. This is a very, very important piece of legislation. The number of biotech companies that went public accessing public capital over the last 5 or 6 years has exploded as a result of that very, very smart public policy that reduces some of the regulational burdens on small companies that were really part of what came out of Sarbanes-Oxley. So again, we're a small company. Small companies have different issues, and we're a part of bio. Many of the companies, actually the majority of the companies in bio, are emerging companies, less than 50 employees. And so we'd like your support as we come in and talk with you about some of the work that we're doing as small emerging biotech companies. So I want to get that done fast, so here you go.
Okay, great. Thanks. So you've all been tremendously patient, and I appreciate that. And so in the interest of letting you all ask questions, maybe if we could have 3 or 4 people ask questions, and then I'll let the panel answer them, and that'll save some time. So does anybody have a question? Yes, ma'am.
I work for the State Department.
There's a mic in back of you.
Hi. I work for the State Department's Intellectual Property Enforcement Office, so my question is mostly for you, Joe. And I was a bit surprised that those 4 countries, because apart from India, those weren't the countries that we spend most of our time on trying to go after on compulsory licensing and other issues. So I was just curious. We do have some issues with the EU, and obviously, but I wasn't aware that Ireland, Germany, and Switzerland were the main source of our deficit. My question was, with this tax reform and in the next few years, do you see that list changing, and who would you see on that list responsible for our deficit?
Sure, I just answer quickly. It's hard to know what's going on exactly with the trade balances, but I think the evidence shows that profit shifting has been a factor. And I believe that on balance, the tax reform had some very good things on the corporate side, bringing down the rate, moving to a territorial system, imposing the tax right away so there's no incentive to park it offshore. And so to the extent that there's been profit shifting, I think that largely should stop, and you should start to see those balances with those individual companies come back into either balance or hopefully a trade surplus with the U.S. Anyone else with a question?
Joe, could I?
Yeah, go
Could you
ahead.
put up a slide for me? I forgot to cover this.
Sure.
I think it's important.
Yeah,
So
that one or the
this was
next one?
the one before that.
Okay.
That one. Yeah. So this was data just published from Science Magazine. It lists all the clinical trials going around the world. Okay. And you can see North America is by far and away the most clinical trials. Over 20,000 clinical trials going on in the U.S. Now I talked about CAR T, and I talked about genome editing. This CRISPR area, 2 big areas. So the next slide. Look at the number of clinical trials that are going on in China on those 2 areas versus what's going on in the U.S. These are groups that are leaving our country and moving over there and setting up CAR T trials and setting up major university organizations to advance their CAR T process. Now, what's interesting about this is CAR T was discovered 15 or so years ago in Philadelphia, Memphis, Tennessee, and New York City, those 3 places. And now we're starting to lose the battle because that's moving over into China, both in genome editing and CAR clinical trials. I think it's an important point that we need to be thinking about as we think about policy here.
There's a question in the back, and then we'll take this one too.
Yes, Brian Darmody from the University of Maryland. So this is for Mitch Horowitz. As you know, the administration has an RFI out on the streets about how to improve commercialization of federal research, the $15 billion they spend, most of which is in the life sciences. I'm just curious, and actually any of the panel members, any ideas on how, from a policy perspective, the federal government can improve its commercialization rate for the research that they do internally at federal labs and also at universities and private sector companies?
Sure.
Why don't we take yours, and then we'll, one more question, and somebody back. Did you have a question? Yeah. And then we can.
Thank you. Andrew Redmond with Monarch Global Strategies. I was curious, I guess I direct this to both Joes. In terms of other governments using monopoly power or using price controls to force the prices of often U.S.-made drugs down, which to some extent forces the prices to be higher here, what should or can the U.S. government, either legislatively or through the executive branch, what can be done to stop countries from doing what seems to them, to a health minister, to be a pretty logical way to provide more healthcare coverage in an era of shrinking budgets?
You want to go first? Any question?
Yeah, great. So to Brian's question, I think the way other countries are going about it, we can learn a lot from. So when they're increasing their R&D, they're not just doing it, giving it to the universities. They're creating the dynamic that Doug was and Joe were mentioning about creating more partnerships and advancing things so that we have a good understanding of what the opportunities are in the real marketplace, and we also have the ability to tap the real know-how that sits in the university in terms of this really exciting science. Countries are also at the national level taking on proof of concept funding. So states are working very hard, and this is so critical to advancing a new discovery, so that when you're in a tech transfer office, you see indications, but you really don't know if it's really valid. And so you need to do additional testing to be able to convince an entrepreneur that this is something that you should form a company around. So lots of states are trying to do it, lots of universities are trying, but everybody is really doing it in a very underfunded way. And so how do we do this as a country to be much more creative about helping our universities begin to show the value of the technologies and then allow the great entrepreneurial ecosystem that we have in this country to really take over? We are going to have to deal with that valley of death and when real venture capital will come in, and there may be some other things that we could be thinking about. Unfortunately, overseas, the one thing that we do better than most is venture capital, and we still have some problems around venture capital. So I think we're going to have to invent those solutions.
And then, Joe, you want to take the one on?
If I can just touch on the Maryland point, Buy-Dole works. If we move on, though, we have a problem in the universities with young researchers. That's an urgent problem that needs to be dealt with, either in terms of funding or reallocation of where the monies go. I think that's important. So let's not break what's working. Let's focus on those things that will restore vitality to that relationship that exists between NIH, the universities, and commercial entities. I think that's one. On the overseas issue, that is a topic that we'll likely hear about before Saturday. My experience in dealing with foreign governments in a number of roles is that it's a matter of trade policy. Healthcare is always special. It's a different sort of value set, but there are these complexities of trading off corn for heparin. And we need to make the decision that medicine is a U.S. trade priority. If we have such dominance in the field and we have such promise on the science side of it, we need to be very articulate and very forceful about IP, about fair and transparent reimbursement methodologies, including the use of health technology assessments. All of this comes into play, but it takes vigor at the top of the trade crew to do much more to help the domestic industry and industries that call the U.S. home.
This gentleman here, and then this lady up front.
Hi, Rich Bendis with BioHealth Innovation. I have a question on conflict of interest policies. National Institute of Health is the largest individual research institute in the world for life sciences, get $3 billion a year, 6,000 scientists, 27 institutes, all located right in Montgomery County. They have one of the worst performance records for tech transfer and commercialization compared to even average universities in the United States. One of the challenges has been their conflict of interest policies are not friendly to investors or pharma companies, bio companies, or strategic people who would like to work with them on commercialization. This happened because 12, 14 years ago, Doug probably knows about it, there was an event that happened. They used to be very friendly to work with industry and investors. The event created them to go to the other side to be one of the worst on conflict of interest of all of our federal agencies. I think if you want to talk about innovation policies, if we could take a look at adjusting the COI policies within NIH, it would loosen some of the greatest innovation opportunities in the world right here in our backyard, and companies around the United States would benefit from it.
And then this lady here. There's a microphone.
Urmila Ghia from the Office of Congresswoman Jayapal, Congressional Fellow. You are from a small company, And it is my sense also that small companies are a great contributor to the output as well as the economy of the state and the nation. And yet, I was glancing through this, which seems to say quite the opposite. Any comments, views on that? Because this is saying that it is a general thinking that small business are drivers of economic growth and job creation. The authors of this book conclude that on average, large firms have a superior track record on job creation, productivity, innovation, etc. And the book argues on policies that will be size neutral in order to encourage growth rather than enshrining the statements that you said. Comments on that?
I've not read the book, so I'm not sure what you're referring to.
And then there's one in the back, and then we'll open it up to the panel. This lady here, and then we'll do the back, and then we'll do you, and then we'll.
Poor guy's getting bounced back and forth. I'm Greg Schuckman from the University of Central Florida. I want to actually pick up on the CRISPR discussion because I think that's an important topic. You talked about technologies that have been developed in the States and that we sort of lost the edge. You know, I think about supersonic transports and hypersonics and how we're looking at foreign competitors there and how we're trying to play catch up. And I worry about us having to do the same with CRISPR, especially not just the medical benefits that might accrue from it, but certainly the economic benefits are extraordinary. So what should we do from a U.S. innovation policy perspective to protect CRISPR, keep it here? I know there's a dispute right now about who owns the key patents and what the field of use patents are going to be for that particular technology, but it seems to be a vital economic sector for the U.S. economy going forward in the decades ahead.
If we can just take this lady's question, and then we'll open it up.
Hi, Bayla LaBeouf from the Joint Economic Committee. I have a question for Doug. So you mentioned a specific regulatory framework that you think would be necessary to encourage the type of innovation that would lead to these types of treatments that would be very beneficial. Specifically, you mentioned that strong regulations, science-based, transparent regulations would be needed. So my question is, can you think of an example of perhaps misguided regulation in your sphere, misguided in the sense that maybe outdated or just not relevant in the context in which it's applied in a new technology space? Could you think of some examples that would be relevant?
Yeah, I can. I'd rather not say them specifically because it may implicate someone. But there isn't, with an FDA, there's a couple of issues. One is I think leadership is really strong right now, and it is science-based. But there isn't best practices across the different groups within FDA. And there are certain areas that are very, very progressive and very interactive, like the cell and gene therapy space. Wonderful to work with. There are other groups within FDA that are a bit more rigid and require extensive and expensive clinical trials. And the issue here is the balance between risk and benefit. And if you have someone who's a center director that is perhaps a little bit more risk intolerant, it's going to be more difficult to get a drug approved. So I think a lot of it has to do with that, and also there's a huge hiring problem at FDA. They cannot keep the number of people that they need on staff. So that's another, and I've heard a lot of reasons why, but I think that's a big one. It's a personnel issue that we need to be addressing. On CRISPR, again, my own personal view is that we've got to be really careful with policy that we put in place. And the reason I say that is because I was around when they did the stem cell moratorium. And I actually went in front of the Senate and testified. That was a very, very difficult turn of events. And we ended up losing our leadership in embryonic stem cell research for a couple of decades. All that work's being done in Korea. It's being done now in Japan, and they are a decade ahead of us in their understanding of how to work with those products, but also in their intellectual property. So with CRISPR, I think we have to have, again, science-based, very rational policies around how we regulate and how we use that. So we're not in a situation where We're allowing certain people to be using the technology for things that could be dangerous. We need to be, and I think it's important that everyone is properly educated on this area because it's pretty complicated, but the impact is huge. I mean, we have a tool now that you can pretty much buy off the internet and edit a genome for a few $1,000s. So this isn't going away. It's going to expand dramatically, and we've got to be really careful and thoughtful about it. Hopefully that answers your question.
Amy?
That's my own personal view.
Amy?
I think that the audience brings up a couple of very important points that are intermingled. One is we have a pendulum that has at times swung a bit too far, and I think Doug does a great example when he compares the stem cell line debate of 15 years ago to CRISPR today. That's absolutely true. And then there is the inconsistency within the FDA. And we do have a strong leader right now who's very creative. And I think it's fair to point to those areas where regulation works, especially in newer areas, and then have a trickle-down effect to some of the other centers, and especially when we're talking about things that just don't fit tightly into one small box. So I think they're very important points, and there is a lot that we can do to improve and modernize FDA regulation.
Okay, and then just on Big is Beautiful, that's a book that was written by ITIF's president, Rob Atkinson, and he's also written some reports recently on the importance of startups and small businesses to the economy. And I think the general point we try and make at ITF is it's not so much the size of the company that's important as what it's doing. And is it in an industry where it faces international competition? Is it in an industry where there are high public spillovers, such as the pharmaceutical or research? Is it an industry that's doing a lot of research or that is engaging in heavy investment? And is it a high-skill, high-tech industry? And if it is, then we ought to be supporting it in some way, whether it's small or large. And so I think if I encourage everybody to go to ITIF's website and see the tremendous volume of reports we put out, advocating for a consistent policy that promotes research, promotes competition, that promotes high productivity, and that promotes higher living standards. I want to thank you all for coming. We're at the end of our time. You've been very patient. I appreciate your spending your time with us, and I encourage you to follow up with any of us with any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.